April 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above France. Through the crystalline canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190F5, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermaschen squinted at the strange silver shapes climbing toward him. They looked absurd, barrel-bodied aircraft puffing their way upward like overfed whales. "The Americans have sent us milk bottles," he laughed into the radio. His wingman chuckled. Below them, 16 massive Republic P-47C Thunderbolts clawed through the thin air, each engine bellowing against the drag of 7 tons of metal and ammunition. To German eyes trained on the elegance of Spitfires and the quick reflex of Messerschmitts, the newcomers seemed like flying jokes. But what the Luftwaffe didn't yet realize was that these lumbering beasts carried the seeds of their own destruction. Beneath those wide wings hid 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, capable of spitting 6,000 rounds per minute, more than enough to shred a fighter in 2 seconds. The laughter echoing through German radios that morning would, within a year, be replaced by silence and fear. At the head of the American formation flew Major Donald Blakesley, commander of the 335th Fighter Squadron. A veteran of the RAF's Eagle squadrons, he understood the paradox of his new mount. The P-47 was no dancer. It was a hammer built to crush rather than duel. Survival meant forgetting everything learned in nimble Spitfires and embracing brute power, energy over elegance. Keep your speed, don't turn, dive, and hit hard. He had drilled into his men. Today they would learn why. Republic Aviation's chief designer Alexander Kartveli had warned from the start. It will be a dinosaur, but with good proportions. When his prototype XP-47B first flew in 1941, engineers gasped. Nearly 10,000 pounds empty, with a turbo-supercharged Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine roaring like thunder, it could climb where German engines suffocated. The Americans hadn't built a duelist. They had built a brawler, one that could keep its full power at 30,000 feet while the Luftwaffe gasped for air. Training in the States had been brutal. The 56 Fighter Group lost more men to accidents than to combat, stalling, torque rolling, overshooting landings. Yet those who mastered the beast swore by it. One rookie, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, remembered his first flight. It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. You didn't fly it, you aimed it. None of them knew that this heavy, unwieldy aircraft would soon become the terror of the European sky. By the end of that cold April morning, the Luftwaffe still laughed. The Thunderbolts were slow, clumsy, and new. Yet in their engines rumbled the future, a future powered by 2,000 horses and 8 relentless guns. But within weeks, that laughter would die in flames, when a young pilot named Robert Johnson faced 16 Focke-Wulfs alone, and survived the impossible. The Luftwaffe's confidence after that April debut bordered on arrogance. Reports flooded German headquarters claiming the new American fighter was meat for the slaughter. Pilots called it the Fliegende Kuh, the flying cow. They joked that it could barely climb and turned slower than a freight train. But as May 1943 unfolded, something unexpected began to surface in gun camera footage and intelligence briefings. These cows refused to die. One Thunderbolt limped home with over 120 bullet holes, its pilot pale but alive. Another returned with an entire cylinder shot out of its engine, yet still crossed the channel. Mechanics shook their heads. Any other fighter would have been scattered metal. The P-47's radial engine, free of fragile coolant lines, shrugged off wounds that would have killed liquid-cooled machines. Beneath its skin, armor plate cradled the pilot like a steel womb. The Americans were discovering they had built a fortress that could fly. On June 26, 1943, that toughness would be tested to the limit. Over Lisieux, France, 48 Thunderbolts of the 61st Fighter Squadron were returning from bomber escort when 16 Focke-Wulfs screamed down from the sun. Among the Americans was 2nd Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, flying near the rear, the worst possible place when predators strike. In seconds, his P-47 was hammered by cannon fire. The canopy exploded, the cockpit filled with oil and hydraulic smoke. A fragment tore through his nose. Blood mixed with fluid on his goggles. He reached for the ejection handle, jammed. A shell had welded the canopy shut. Trapped in a burning coffin at 27,000 feet, Johnson prepared to die. Yet the Thunderbolt refused. The flames flickered, starved of oxygen. The crippled engine coughed and caught again. Half blind, he leveled out and pointed west toward England. Moments later, a lone Focke-Wulf 190 appeared behind him. The German pilot lined up his sights and fired every remaining cannon shell. Then, as if disbelief compelled him, he drew alongside the riddled Thunderbolt. Johnson saw his face, young, blonde, eyes wide. The German shook his head, saluted, and peeled away, out of ammunition and comprehension. Johnson's P-47 made it back across the channel, collapsing on the runway at Manston with more than 200 holes in its frame. Mechanics quit counting halfway through. When word spread, disbelief turned to reverence. The aircraft that had once been mocked was now being studied by engineers with awe. "We didn't know we'd built something this strong," one remarked. German pilots hearing the story refused to believe it until they faced it themselves. That day, Robert Johnson proved the Thunderbolt could survive hell itself. What came next would prove it could unleash it, when American pilots learned how to turn weight into a weapon. By mid-1943, the Luftwaffe still believed the P-47 to be a clumsy intruder out of its depth. Yet, within the 56th Fighter Group, hard-won experience was forging a new doctrine. Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke gathered his men on the wet tarmac of Horsham St. Faith. "Forget what you knew about turning fights," he barked. "This machine isn't about grace, it's about momentum. You dive, you strike, and you climb away. Let them chase gravity, we'll ride it." The Thunderbolt's massive frame and turbo-supercharged engine gave it something few fighters possessed: potential energy. At 30,000 feet, it could dive faster than anything in the sky. Where German engines sputtered in thin air, the double Wasp roared, its supercharger feeding sea-level power into the stratosphere. Pilots began calling these dives thunder runs. When a P-47 fell earthward, the air itself seemed to tremble. Lieutenant Walker "Bud" Mahurin perfected the tactic. Spotting Focke-Wulfs below, he rolled inverted, pointed the nose down, and screamed through mock-brushed air at over 550 miles per hour. In seconds he crossed the enemy formation, squeezed the trigger, and watched one fighter disintegrate before rolling skyward again. "They never saw us coming," he later said. "It wasn't a dogfight, it was a harvest." The German pilots, long used to dueling agility, found themselves overwhelmed by velocity and firepower. When a Thunderbolt opened up, 8 heavy Brownings created a storm of metal dense enough to saw a fighter in half. Gun camera film from the summer of '43 showed Messerschmitts literally disintegrating mid-air, pieces scattering like burning leaves. Even seasoned aces began whispering of the wall of lead. On August 17, 1943, the thunder truly rolled. During the dual raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, P-47s met German Bf 110 destroyers moving to strike the bombers. Major David Schilling led the attack from 28,000 feet. His unit dove as one. In less than 60 seconds, 8 German fighters vanished. Witnesses called it a sky full of falling wings. The Luftwaffe's illusion of invulnerability shattered that day. That mission marked a turning point. The Americans had stopped playing by European rules. Their aircraft was heavy, loud, and unstoppable, the embodiment of industrial warfare in the air. But the Germans weren't done yet. As the Thunderbolt's legend grew, the Luftwaffe prepared new weapons and new traps, unaware that the P-47 was about to evolve again into something even deadlier. By the winter of 1943, the Luftwaffe's laughter had faded into uneasy silence. Their once superior fighters were losing altitude, literally. Reports described American planes diving from the edge of space, striking like meteors, then vanishing into the sun. Still, German pilots clung to one advantage: climb rate. At least they thought they did. That illusion ended when the new P-47D-22 arrived in England. The innovation was deceptively simple: a Hamilton standard hydromatic propeller with broad paddle blades over 13 feet long. It bit into the air like an axe through wood, turning brute horsepower into pure climb. The first test flights stunned veteran pilots. The heavy fighter that once struggled past 20,000 feet now surged upward at nearly 3,000 feet per minute. In level flight, its acceleration felt explosive, as though the aircraft itself had finally caught up with its name, Thunderbolt. The transformation wasn't just mechanical. It was psychological. German pilots who had mocked the flying pigs began reporting encounters with a new menace. "The fat ones climb now," one ace warned in his combat diary. "They follow us to 30,000 feet, and when they shoot, the world explodes." From that moment on, the very sound of those blades became legend. The tips neared supersonic speed, generating a deep, rolling thunder audible from miles away. Allied ground crews called it music. German troops called it Donnerschlag, the Thunderclap. By early 1944, the Thunderbolt had become a true long-range hunter. Equipped with external drop tanks, it could escort bombers deep into Germany, farther than any American fighter before it. In the thin blue air above Hanover, Major Heinz Nock of JG-11 learned the hard way. Expecting the usual lumbering opponents, his unit dove on a formation of new P-47s and found themselves outclimbed. "They turned into us," Nock wrote later, "and came up after us like eagles." Schmidt vanished in a flash of fire. For the first time, the Luftwaffe faced an American fighter that could meet them on every vertical plane. Faster in a dive, equal in a climb, indestructible in defense. Even German ground units could recognize the new variant by sound alone. "When we heard that thunder," one Panzer commander recalled, "we knew death was coming." By March 1944, domination of the upper atmosphere was complete. The P-47 had evolved from a punchline into a prophecy of industrial warfare, a machine that embodied the relentless power of American production. But air superiority was only half the story. Soon, the Thunderbolt would descend to Earth, trading altitude for devastation, and prove it could wage war not just in the sky but on the ground below. By the spring of 1944, the skies over Europe were no longer contested, they were owned. The Luftwaffe, bled white by attrition, had ceded the upper air. But the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was not finished. It was only descending. American planners saw in its armor and firepower a new kind of weapon, one that could destroy an army from the air. On training fields in southern England, pilots practiced low-level attacks until hedgerows blurred past their wings. Beneath each wing, two 1,000-pound bombs. Beneath the fuselage, another 500. What had begun as a high-altitude escort fighter now carried the load of a medium bomber. Armorer crews mixed the Thunderbolt's trademark .50 caliber ammunition, armor-piercing incendiary, tracer, and ball, in repeating sequences designed to ignite and penetrate simultaneously. "When those guns fired," said one mechanic, "it sounded like tearing the sky in half." When the invasion of France came on June 6, 1944, over 500 P-47s thundered across the Channel. They flew in stacked formations from sea level to 30,000 feet, forming an iron canopy over the beaches. German aircraft that tried to reach Normandy were torn apart before they could glimpse the shoreline. "The sky belonged to the Americans," recalled Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer, one of only 3 German pilots to return from the day's first sortie. But the real slaughter began after the beaches were secured. The Thunderbolts spread out across the French countryside, hunting anything that moved. Columns of trucks, trains, and tanks became prey for what soldiers soon called the J-bows, Jag bombers. A typical attack lasted less than 10 seconds. Rockets streaking, bombs blooming, and 8 Brownings hammering until the target vanished in dust and flame. Survivors spoke of the ground shaking like an earthquake. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzergrenadier Regiment, described it with terror. "They came so low we could see the pilots' faces. The sound alone broke men's courage. A column of 20 trucks simply ceased to exist." The Thunderbolt had become flying artillery, each sortie rewriting the map of Europe one burning road at a time. In the month after D-Day alone, 9th Air Force Thunderbolts destroyed 651 locomotives, 3,800 trucks, 512 tanks, and thousands of horse-drawn vehicles. Movement by daylight became suicide. German officers began issuing orders to travel only at night, and even then, the rumble of engines made hearts race. Yet while the roads of France burned beneath their guns, across the continent the Luftwaffe plotted one last counterstrike, and the Thunderbolt was about to prove it could face even jets. By late 1944, the war in the air had changed again. Germany's secret weapons had taken flight, the Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was fast, sleek, and unlike anything the Allies had ever faced. At 540 miles per hour, it could outrun any propeller-driven plane alive. German propaganda called it the miracle that will turn the tide. But the Americans had a miracle of their own, a brute that refused to yield the sky. The Me-262 could climb and sprint, but it was helpless during takeoff and landing. Thunderbolt pilots learned to wait above German airfields, engines rumbling like thunderclouds. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group spotted a jet lifting from its runway near Osnabrück. Diving from 28,000 feet, he hit 500 miles per hour, the limit of what aluminum could endure. His tracers tore through the jet before its gear retracted. The Me-262 exploded in mid-air, twin engines spinning away like burning wheels. The concentrated fire of 850s, he wrote, was more effective than we ever dreamed. As 1945 dawned, the Luftwaffe gambled everything on one last offensive, Operation Bodenplatte. At dawn on January 1st, nearly 900 German fighters attacked Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. The 365th Fighter Group at WWII-34 airfield near Metz woke to chaos. Rockets fell, hangars burned, and 22 Thunderbolts were destroyed on the ground. A captured German pilot smirked at the wreckage. "What do you think of that?" he asked. Major George Brooking pointed toward the horizon where replacement aircraft were already arriving. "By tomorrow," he said calmly, "we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" Within 48 hours, the answer was clear. The Luftwaffe had lost 271 aircraft and 213 pilots, including many of its last veterans. Allied losses were replaced within days. America's factories, not just its fighters, had conquered the air. Each new P-47 arriving from England bore a fresh shine, engines roaring as if to announce that Germany could never catch up again. By early 1945, Thunderbolt pilots had done the impossible. They had outfought jets with pistons. They called themselves jet hunters. It wasn't speed that won. It was discipline, firepower, and industrial endurance. But the Thunderbolt's final evolution was still to come. As Europe burned and the Pacific waited, engineers prepared a variant so powerful it could chase the rising sun itself, the P-47N. While Europe burned beneath the roar of Thunderbolts, across the Pacific another kind of war demanded endurance. Distances stretched beyond imagination. Jungles, storms, and oceanic voids that swallowed entire squadrons. The Republic engineers answered with evolution, the P-47N, a version that looked familiar but hid monumental change. Its wings were wider and heavier, fitted with wet fuel tanks holding 93 gallons each. Combined with drop tanks, it could now fly 2,350 miles, far enough to escort bombers to Tokyo itself. In the skies above New Guinea and the Philippines, the 348th Fighter Group discovered the P-47's new destiny. Colonel Neil Kirby, leading his squadron against 40 Japanese fighters near WWII, charged alone into the formation. Diving through flak, he destroyed 6 aircraft in a single mission, an act that earned him the Medal of Honor. "They called us monsters," one Japanese survivor later wrote. "Our cannon shells broke on their armor. Their return fire tore our planes to ribbons." Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, one of the Empire's most respected pilots, would later recall his first encounter with the Jug. "I fired dozens of 20mm rounds into one Thunderbolt and watched it fly away. Their bullets came back like a solid beam of light. Our fighters simply disintegrated. Against fragile Zeros, the P-47 was a beast from another world, its radial engine shrugging off hits, its guns turning aerial duels into massacres. The new P-47N made the vast Pacific feel smaller. Operating from Saipan, Guam, and Ie Shima, These aircraft became the bodyguards of the B-29 superfortresses en route to Japan. Pilots joked that they had traded the mud of Normandy for the endless glare of the Pacific sun. But there was no humor when they faced kamikazes and anti-aircraft fire over enemy waters. "We'd fly 6 hours just to fight for 15 minutes, one pilot recalled. Every gallon counted. Every bullet mattered. For the first time, the Thunderbolt was not just a weapon of dominance. It was a bridge of endurance, the link between distant islands and the mainland of Japan. And it would soon face its most dangerous challenge: the jets of a dying empire and the storm of war's final months. As the Pacific campaign reached its climax, the Jug would meet its final test, against Japan's last defenders and a world racing toward atomic dawn. By early 1945, the Pacific had become a graveyard of burning wrecks and blackened airfields. The once proud Japanese air arm was now a shadow, starved of fuel, pilots, and hope. But when thunderbolts appeared over the horizon, gleaming silver against the sunrise, even that shadow flinched. Pilots on both sides spoke of the sound before the sight, a deep, rolling growl that grew into a scream of metal and vengeance. To many Japanese soldiers, it was not an aircraft approaching. It was fate itself. At Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Thunderbolt became more than an escort, it became a storm. Flying from newly captured strips, P-47s scoured the seas for convoys and bombarded defensive lines with rockets and napalm. When they returned, wings were blackened with soot, gun barrels glowing dull red. "You could smell the war on her," one mechanic said, running a hand along the scorched skin of a returning Jug. In the skies above Japan, the enemy's last miracle machines appeared, fast, desperate interceptors built in dwindling factories. Kawasaki Ki 100s and Nakajima Ki 84 francs. Yet their fuel was poor, their pilots green, and their courage outmatched by American firepower. On April 7, 1945, a Thunderbolt squadron escorting B-29s near Kyushu encountered the Empire's final counterattack. In less than 3 minutes, 8 enemy fighters were destroyed. Not a single Jug was lost. "It felt wrong," one pilot confessed later. "We were fighting ghosts." Back in Europe, the Luftwaffe was dying the same death. Starved of fuel and experience, its new jets and piston fighters alike were torn apart by Allied swarms. The surviving German pilots described a phenomenon doctors later named Jabo fever, fighter-bomber fever, a crippling terror that caused vomiting, shaking, and paralysis at the mere sound of approaching thunderbolts. Courage was useless, one captured ace admitted. The Thunderbolt did not duel. It executed. By May 1945, victory was inevitable. The Luftwaffe no longer existed as a coherent force, and in the Pacific the Japanese airfields were smoking ruins. Yet the P-47s kept flying, strafing, escorting, guarding until the end. When peace finally came, the same engines that had once carried destruction now roared over surrendered cities in silent tribute to the thousands who never came back. The Thunderbolt had started the war as a laughingstock and ended it as a symbol of unstoppable might. But behind its thunder lay exhaustion, of men, of nations, of the sky itself. The guns would fall silent, but the legend was just beginning. As peace dawned, both friend and foe would look back and ask the same question: how did one machine come to define the power of an entire nation? The war's end revealed a truth even the victors struggled to comprehend. It wasn't just courage or tactics that had won the air, it was production. Between 1942 and 1945, Republic Aviation built 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts, more than any other American fighter. At the Farmingdale plant on Long Island, workers assembled one aircraft every hour, 24 hours a day. In Evansville, Indiana, a factory that had been cornfield only months before was now birthing 500 Thunderbolts a month. The rhythm of hammers and rivet guns became the heartbeat of victory. Each machine demanded 65,000 parts, 8 miles of wiring, and 2,400 precision-cut engine components. A symphony of steel, oil, and mathematics. Yet many of the people who built them had never seen an airplane before the war. Housewives, secretaries, and farmhands became the new industrial army. They weren't forging swords of conquest. They were building armor for boys they'd never meet. "Every bolt I drive," one worker said, "is a prayer that someone makes it home." Fuel, ammunition, and pilots followed in the same overwhelming tide. Each P-47 consumed 100 gallons of fuel per hour, and the 9th Air Force alone burned 25 million gallons monthly. The Lake City Arsenal produced 30 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition every month, each bullet machined to perfection. Across the Atlantic, convoys carried an ocean of oil, lead, and determination. The Germans called it the avalanche of steel. When the guns fell silent in 1945, captured German officers were asked what had broken their air force. Most didn't name the P-51 or the Spitfire. They said the P-47 because it never stopped coming. One interrogation report quoted a veteran ace. "They laughed when we first saw them. Fat, slow, ridiculous. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to turn or climb. They only needed to aim. And when they fired, we ceased to exist." Decades later, at a reunion in Phoenix, former enemies met as old men. General Adolf Galland, once head of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, was asked what he thought of the Thunderbolt. He smiled sadly. "We built perfection in miniature," he said. "They built perfection in numbers." The P-47 wasn't just a fighter. It was a message that America could outfly, outbuild, and outendure anyone. Today, in the quiet halls of the U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton, a restored P-47D rests beneath spotlights. On its plaque are numbers, weight, range, firepower, but the real story sits beside it. A strip of gun camera film showing a Focke-Wulf disintegrating in midair, and a small sign that reads, "We laughed when we first saw them. We didn't laugh again." The laughter that once filled the radios over France had long since died away. What remained was thunder, the sound of power, endurance, and inevitability. The sound of a machine that changed the sky forever. From mockery to legend, from milk bottle to warhammer, the P-47 Thunderbolt didn't just fight the war. It defined it. When the guns finally went silent, the sky seemed impossibly empty. Thousands of P-47s stood silent on airfields across Europe and the Pacific, wings drooping, engines cooling, their thunder spent. For mechanics who had lived by their roar, the stillness was unsettling. Yet even in silence, the Jug had one more mission: to carry its legacy into the next age of flight. Many Thunderbolts went home to teach a new generation. Others were sold to allied nations or scrapped for aluminum that would soon become airliners and washing machines, peaceful echoes of wartime industry. But some, repainted in bright post-war markings, flew again in Korea, Latin America, and even China. Their deep-chested engines still carried the same growl that once terrified Europe. The sound of that radial engine, steady, confident, unapologetic, became the soundtrack of American aviation itself. For the men who flew them, the memories never faded. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, who once returned home with 200 holes in his airplane, later wrote that the P-47 had a soul of steel and mercy. It got you home when nothing else could. Decades after the war, veterans described dreams of that heavy machine shuddering through cloud, guns blazing. Their youth preserved forever in the noise and fire. In engineering halls and museums, the Thunderbolt's lessons endured. Its turbo-supercharger technology shaped jet turbine design. Its rugged construction philosophy influenced generations of attack aircraft, from the A-10 Warthog to the F-15E Strike Eagle. The spirit of the P-47, overbuilt, overpowered, and unbreakable, became the DNA of modern air power. And somewhere, on quiet summer days, that sound still returns. Not from the sky of war, but from the engines of lovingly restored Jugs performing over airfields across America. Crowds look up as that old roar rolls over the horizon. Children cover their ears, and veterans smile through tears. The thunder, once feared, is now cherished, a reminder of what courage and industry can create when the world demands the impossible. The age of propellers gave way to jets, and the jet age to rockets. Yet somewhere in every engine's hum and every sky's echo remains that same deep resonance, the heartbeat of a machine that refused to die. The war ended, but its thunder never faded. The P-47 Thunderbolt still flies, not just through the clouds, but through history itself.